81%. That's how many white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump in 2016. 8 years later, in 2024, that number held steady at 82%. But behind that statistic is a story the numbers don't tell. Thousands of evangelicals are walking away from the movement they once called home. Not because they stopped believing in Jesus, but because they can no longer reconcile their faith with the politics of their churches. They're leaving congregations where Trump's name is mentioned more than Christ's, where MAGA hats outnumber Bibles, where loyalty to a political leader has become a test of Christian orthodoxy. Meet Rachel, a lifelong Southern Baptist who left her church in Georgia after the 2024 election. "I couldn't take communion with people who cheered when Trump mocked a disabled reporter," she told me. "How can we claim to follow Jesus and celebrate cruelty?" Meet David, a former worship leader in Texas who resigned after his pastor told the congregation that voting Democrat was sinning against God. "I realized my church had become a Trump rally with a worship band," he said. "The gospel had been replaced with grievance, nationalism, and culture war. Today, we're investigating the Trump evangelical divide that's tearing American Christianity apart. Why some Christians see Trump as God's chosen vessel while others see him as a false prophet. How evangelicalism became so politically captive that questioning Trump means questioning your faith. And why thousands are choosing exile from their churches rather than compromise their consciences. If you want to understand the most significant fracture in American evangelicalism since the Civil War, subscribe now. Because what's happening isn't just about politics. It's about the soul of Christianity in America. Let me show you what's actually happening because the aggregate statistics hide the fracture. Yes, 82% of white evangelicals voted for Trump in 2024. But that number masks significant departures among younger evangelicals and those leaving the movement entirely. A 2024 Pew Research study found that the percentage of Americans identifying as evangelical dropped from 25% in 2016 to 21% in 2024. That's roughly 10 million people who no longer identify with evangelicalism. Many specifically cite Trump and evangelical political alignment as reasons for leaving. Among evangelicals under 40, Trump support is notably lower, around 65% compared to 90% among those over 65. The generational divide is stark and growing. Young evangelicals are either moderating politically or leaving evangelicalism entirely. The exodus includes pastors, worship leaders, seminary professors, and missionaries. People who spent decades in evangelical ministry now describe themselves as exvangelical or post-evangelical. They've left institutions they loved because those institutions chose Trump over the teachings of Jesus. Social media reveals the scale. The hashtag #exvangelical has been used over 500,000 times, often with Trump-related grievances. The hashtag #empathypews documents people leaving churches over political captivity. This isn't a few disgruntled progressives, this is a movement. Churches are losing members not to secularism but to disillusionment with evangelicalism's political corruption. And while 82% still support Trump, the remaining 18% and the millions who've left represent a crisis evangelical leaders aren't addressing. They're celebrating electoral victory while their movement fractures from within. Pastor Mike served a Southern Baptist church in North Carolina for 18 years. He baptized babies, married couples, buried saints. He loved his congregation deeply. But after the 2024 election, he resigned. Mike told me what broke him wasn't Trump winning. It was watching his congregation celebrate with more joy than they showed at Easter. It was hearing deacons say Trump was anointed by God while refugees suffered at the border. "I preached the Sermon on the Mount and people told me I was being political," Mike said. "I preached about caring for the poor and was accused of promoting socialism. But when I mentioned Trump, everyone nodded in agreement like I just read scripture." Mike tried addressing the issue gently, then directly. He preached about Jesus' command to love enemies and was told he needed to be more patriotic. He preached about truth and integrity and was accused of attacking the president. The final straw came when a congregant said, "I trust Trump more than I trust you about what Christians should believe." Mike realized he'd lost his church to a political idol. He resigned, moved to another state, and is rebuilding his ministry among Christians who left evangelicalism for the same reasons. Mike's story isn't unique, it's pattern. Pastors across America face the same dilemma. Compromise your conscience or lose your church. Many are choosing conscience and finding that exile is less painful than complicity. The divide centers on a fundamental question. Is Donald Trump God's chosen leader or a dangerous demagogue? For 82% of white evangelicals, the answer is clear: he's chosen. They see Trump as a modern Cyrus, the Persian king God used to accomplish his purposes despite personal flaws. They point to his Supreme Court appointments overturning Roe v. Wade. They celebrate his defense of religious liberty and support for Israel. They believe God raised him up to save America from godless progressivism. For those leaving, the answer is equally clear. Trump embodies everything Jesus opposed: pride, greed, cruelty, dishonesty, exploitation of the vulnerable. They see evangelicals defending the indefensible and calling it faith. The divide isn't ultimately about Trump himself. It's about whether evangelicals will choose prophetic witness or political power, whether they'll prioritize the gospel or electoral victory. Subscribe now if you're wondering how evangelicalism got to this point. Because the Trump divide didn't emerge in 2016, it was decades in the making. And understanding how we got here is essential to understanding where we're going. The seeds of today's divide were planted in the 1970s and 80s with the moral majority. Jerry Falwell and other evangelical leaders mobilized Christians for political activism. They argued that Christians had a duty to vote for candidates who upheld biblical values. The movement achieved significant political power. Evangelicals became essential to Republican electoral coalitions. But the alliance came with costs that weren't apparent initially. Evangelicals learned to prioritize political outcomes over personal character. They supported candidates based on policy positions rather than moral integrity. The message became, it doesn't matter who they are personally, only what they'll do for us politically. This transactional approach to politics set the stage for Trump. Once you've established that personal morality doesn't matter if political outcomes are right, you can justify supporting anyone. The moral majority created the theological framework that would later embrace Trump. The 1990s confirmed this trajectory. Evangelicals defended Bill Clinton's impeachment on moral grounds, while many conservatives overlooked Newt Gingrich's multiple marriages. The standard was inconsistent. Morality mattered for Democrats but not Republicans. By the 2000s, evangelicalism had become a de facto religious arm of the Republican Party. Cultural issues like abortion and gay marriage were wedge issues mobilizing evangelical voters. But the deeper integration was ideological. Conservative politics and evangelical faith became inseparable. When Trump entered the 2016 race, many evangelical leaders initially opposed him. Russell Moore, then at the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, called him morally unfit. The National Review published against Trump, with evangelical signatories arguing he contradicted Christian values. But as Trump secured the nomination, evangelical leaders faced a choice: support him despite his obvious moral failings, or allow Hillary Clinton to win. The majority chose pragmatism over principle. Jerry Falwell Jr. endorsed Trump early, citing the need for a strong leader. Robert Jeffress, Paula White, and James Dobson followed, arguing Trump would defend religious liberty. The Cyrus argument emerged: Trump is like the pagan Persian king God used to accomplish his purposes. The 2016 evangelical vote shocked many observers. After decades of preaching about character and morality, evangelicals overwhelmingly supported a thrice-married casino owner who bragged about sexual assault. The hypocrisy was glaring, and critics pounced. But evangelical leaders defended the choice. Supreme Court appointments justified everything. Overturning Roe v. Wade was worth any moral compromise. The transactional bargain was complete. Evangelicals would provide votes and religious legitimacy. Trump would deliver conservative judges and policies. Personal character was irrelevant as long as political outcomes were right. What happened between 2016 and 2020 wasn't just political alliance, it was theological transformation. Trump didn't just receive evangelical support, he became a religious figure himself. Prophecies declared he was anointed by God. Paintings depicted him as divinely chosen. Worship songs praised his leadership. Paula White, Trump's spiritual advisor, led prayers declaring demonic forces opposed Trump. Evangelical conferences featured more discussion of Trump than of Jesus. Pastors who criticized Trump faced accusations of betraying God's anointed. The language became increasingly cultic and nationalistic. God and country merged into a single ideology. American flags in sanctuaries became as prominent as crosses. Critics within evangelicalism were purged or silenced. Russell Moore was forced out of his SBC role for opposing Trump. Christianity Today's editor Mark Galli wrote an editorial calling for Trump's removal after impeachment and faced massive backlash. Evangelical churches that maintained political neutrality were accused of cowardice. Pastors who refused to endorse Trump from the pulpit were seen as compromising with evil. The movement demanded total loyalty not to Christ but to Trump. The January 6th Capitol riot revealed how deep the radicalization went. Christian flags and Jesus Saves signs mixed with Confederate flags and QAnon symbols. Evangelical leaders had created a movement where violence against perceived enemies could be justified as spiritual warfare. The Supreme Court's Dobbs decision in 2022 overturning Roe v. Wade should have been evangelicalism's victory lap. They'd achieved their most important political goal after 50 years. But instead of celebration, it revealed that the movement had lost its way. Because overturning Roe didn't satisfy the political appetite evangelicals had developed. It intensified it, proving that political power was now the point rather than any specific policy. The goal shifted from protecting life to dominating culture. The Dobbs decision also exposed that much pro-life rhetoric had been political rather than theological. When red states passed abortion bans with no exceptions for rape or life of the mother, many evangelicals were uncomfortable. When pregnant women faced prosecution, some questioned whether this was what they'd fought for. The lack of comprehensive support for mothers and children post-Roe revealed inconsistency. If abortion is murder, why weren't evangelicals demanding universal health care, paid family leave, and childcare support? The focus seemed more about controlling women than protecting life. For many evangelicals already questioning Trump alignment, Dobbs was clarifying. They'd achieved the policy goal but at the cost of their witness. They'd won the political battle but lost the moral authority to proclaim the gospel. The 2024 campaign brought the contradictions to crisis. Trump's legal troubles, multiple indictments, and civil judgments should have given evangelicals pause. Instead, they doubled down, treating legal accountability as persecution. Prominent evangelical leaders declared that prosecuting Trump was spiritual warfare against Christianity. They fundraised off his legal troubles, framing him as a martyr. Some churches prayed for Trump more than they prayed for missions or the lost. Trump himself became more explicit about transactional expectations. He demanded evangelical loyalty and threatened to punish Christians who didn't support him. He mocked Christianity when convenient while claiming to be its champion. His statements grew more authoritarian. Promises to be a dictator on day one, threats to prosecute enemies, rhetoric about vermin and poisoning the blood. Language that echoed fascist leaders of the past. Yet evangelical support remained unwavering. The evangelical case for Trump evolved beyond policy. It became about identity. Real Christians support Trump, fake Christians don't. The marker of evangelical identity shifted from confession of Christ to support of Trump. For Christians troubled by this direction, the 2024 election forced decision. Stay in churches that had become Trump rallies, or leave communities they'd belonged to for decades. Thousands chose to leave, prioritizing conscience over community. The election result vindicated Trump supporters within evangelicalism. 82% voted for him, he won, and they felt justified. But the victory came at enormous cost. Thousands of evangelicals walked away, disgusted by what their movement had become. Sarah grew up in a white evangelical megachurch in Tennessee. She was a worship leader, missions trip veteran, and Bible study small group leader. Her entire life was built around her church community. After 2016, she started noticing things that troubled her. Sermons that mentioned Trump positively but never addressed his character. Small groups that spent more time discussing politics than scripture. Worship services where American flags were as prominent as the cross. She tried raising concerns gently with her pastor. He told her she was being divisive and needed to submit to leadership. When she questioned celebrating Trump's victory, she was told she might not be truly saved. The breaking point came in 2024 when her pastor endorsed Trump from the pulpit. He said voting Democrat was incompatible with Christian faith. Sarah realized her church had become a political organization using religious language. She left the church where she'd been a member for 15 years. She lost her community, her friends, and her sense of spiritual home. She now attends a small, non-denominational church that refuses to endorse political candidates. "I didn't leave Christianity," Sarah told me, her voice breaking. "I left evangelicalism because evangelicalism left Jesus. They chose political power over the Sermon on the Mount, and I couldn't follow them there." The departing evangelicals are forcing a theological reckoning. They're asking questions evangelical leaders can't or won't answer satisfactorily. How can you defend Trump's cruelty and claim to follow Jesus who commanded loving enemies? How can you support a man who embodies every sin the Bible condemns? Pride, greed, lust, dishonesty, cruelty, and call it faithfulness. How can you prioritize political power over Christian witness and claim to care about the gospel? How can you demonize immigrants while claiming to follow Jesus who said, "I was a stranger and you welcomed me"? The standard evangelical responses don't satisfy. God uses flawed people, yes, but He doesn't call us to celebrate their flaws. We're voting for policies, not character. But Jesus said character matters, that trees are known by fruit. He's our Cyrus. But Cyrus wasn't held up as a model of godliness, and we're not ancient Israelites in exile. The theological gymnastics required to justify Trump support are exhausting. And many evangelicals are deciding they'd rather leave than continue the mental contortions. The reckoning also involves confronting evangelicalism's historical sins. The movement that claims to care about character defended slavery, segregation, and white supremacy. The pattern is consistent. When political power conflicts with Christian ethics, evangelicals choose power. Trump is the latest iteration of this pattern, not an aberration. And recognizing that forces questioning whether evangelicalism was ever truly about Jesus, or whether it's always been about power, wrapped in religious language. Those leaving evangelicalism over Trump are finding each other and building new communities. Online groups like Evangelicals and Post-Evangelical have tens of thousands of members. They process trauma, share resources, and support each other through the isolation of leaving. Some are planting new churches explicitly for evangelicals who left over politics. These churches emphasize Jesus' teachings on love, justice, and mercy. They refuse to endorse political candidates or conflate Christianity with nationalism. Others are joining mainline Protestant denominations like Episcopal, Methodist, or Presbyterian churches. They're finding homes in traditions that separate faith from partisan politics. Still others are exploring Catholicism or Orthodoxy, seeking ancient liturgy untainted by American evangelical culture. The exile experience is painful but also liberating. Former evangelicals describe feeling free to read the Bible without political lens. They can engage social issues like racism, poverty, and immigration without being told they're betraying their faith. They're rediscovering Jesus apart from the political Jesus of white evangelicalism. The Jesus who blessed peacemakers, not warriors. Who told Peter to put away his sword, not to fight for political power. The exile communities are asking what Christianity looks like when it's not captive to politics. They're experimenting with new forms of church that prioritize discipleship over culture war. Whether these experiments succeed long-term is uncertain, but they represent genuine attempts at reform. Not everyone troubled by Trump leaves evangelicalism. Many stay, hoping to be reforming voices from within. But staying comes with costs that are increasingly untenable. Pastors who stay while disagreeing must remain silent or face consequences. They watch congregations they're supposed to shepherd become radicalized. They perform mental gymnastics justifying what they know is wrong. Laypeople who stay feel increasingly alienated in their own churches. They sit through sermons that twist scripture to support political narratives. They take communion with people whose politics contradict the gospel they claim. The cognitive dissonance is exhausting and spiritually damaging. How long can you remain in a community whose values contradict your deepest convictions? How long can you stay silent about injustice for the sake of unity? Some who stay describe it as exile within their own churches. They're present physically but disengaged spiritually. They wait for the Trump era to pass, hoping their churches will return to sanity. But others question whether that's wishful thinking. Trump revealed evangelicalism's true priorities. He didn't create them. The question is whether evangelicalism can reform or whether it's too far gone. 3 scenarios seem possible for evangelicalism's future post-Trump. First, evangelicalism continues its current trajectory. Trump remains the defining figure even after he's gone politically. The movement becomes explicitly nationalist, Christian in name only. It hemorrhages younger members and educated professionals but maintains political power through rural and older voters. Eventually, it becomes a regional phenomenon rather than a national movement. Second, evangelicalism fractures permanently. The Trump divide becomes an irreparable schism. Pro-Trump evangelicals and ex-evangelicals become separate movements that don't recognize each other. This might be healthier than forced unity around compromise. Each group can pursue their version of Christianity without pretending to agree. The fracture allows authentic witness from those who reject political captivity. Third, and least likely, evangelicalism undergoes genuine reform. Younger leaders repudiate Trump-era compromises and return to gospel-centered faith. The movement acknowledges its sins and rebuilds on foundation of Jesus's actual teachings. This requires humility evangelicalism hasn't shown in decades. It requires admitting the Trump alliance was catastrophic moral failure. And it requires listening to those who left rather than dismissing them as apostates. Which scenario unfolds depends on choices being made now. But current trajectory suggests fracture is most likely. The divide has become too deep for easy reconciliation. 82% of white evangelicals voted for Trump in 2024. Behind that statistic are thousands walking away from evangelicalism. Not because they stopped believing in Jesus, but because their churches chose Trump over Christ. This isn't a story about politics, though politics is the catalyst. It's a story about what happens when churches prioritize power over prophetic witness, when they choose electoral victory over gospel faithfulness. The departing evangelicals aren't progressives who never belonged. They're worship leaders, pastors, missionaries, seminary graduates. People who gave their lives to evangelicalism and left only when staying became spiritual suicide. Their exodus reveals that evangelicalism faces existential crisis. The movement can't sustain itself on political power alone. Without theological integrity and moral witness, it's just Republican Party at prayer. For those staying, the challenge is whether reform is possible. Can evangelicalism extricate itself from Trump's shadow? Can it return to Jesus's teachings about love, mercy, justice, and truth? For those who've left, the challenge is building new communities. Christianity that's faithful to Jesus without the political baggage. Faith that prioritizes discipleship over domination. The Trump evangelical divide is the most significant fracture in American Christianity since the Civil War. It's redefining what it means to be evangelical, and it's forcing every Christian to decide. Will you choose Jesus or will you choose power? For thousands, that choice has already been made. They've chosen exile over compromise. They've walked away from communities they loved because those communities abandoned the faith they claimed. History will judge both sides of this divide. But in the present moment, the cost is real and the pain is deep. Families divided, friendships ended, churches emptied. If this investigation challenged you, convicted you, or opened your eyes, subscribe now. This isn't just about Trump or evangelicalism. It's about whether Christianity in America can survive its political captivity. The answer to that question will be written in the choices Christians make now. Will we choose prophetic witness or political power? Will we follow Jesus or follow our preferred political leader? The Trump-evangelical divide forces that choice on everyone, and thousands have already decided. They're walking away, choosing faithfulness over belonging, truth over tribe. May we have the courage to make the same choice, even when it costs us everything we thought we couldn't live without. Because some things matter more than political victory or institutional survival. The gospel matters more. Jesus matters more. And sometimes following him means walking away from everyone who claims his name but denies his teachings. That's the lesson of the Trump-evangelical divide. And it's a lesson American Christianity desperately needs to learn before it's too late.